Hello, my friends. Today we are going to be talking about credit scores 101 and the other big factors that matter that aren't often talked about when we go into depth about credit scores. We'll get into those in a little bit, but it is important to be able to see the big picture in these regards. As many of you know, I am not your typical financial guru out there. I get annoyed with much of the traditional advice that is all about restriction and having to track every single penny and keep every one of your receipts. Instead, my story is a little bit different with money. I didn't want to get obsessed with it. I wanted to create systems that work with our money psychology and allow us to go and live the lives that we want to live while minimizing the amount of time that we actually have to spend in the details. And in order to do that, we really need to be able to see the big picture. When it comes to credit scores specifically, we really want to be doing the 20% of things that make 80% of the difference in our financial lives and not the other way around. So we'll talk about some of the more specific details. We'll talk about things like DTI, the debt to income ratio, or LTV, the loan to value, that often come up when people go to apply for a loan or something that needs credit involved and that they didn't realize mattered along with that credit score. So with that said, let's jump into things. Here's what we're going to be talking about today. First of all, what are credit scores and why do we care about them? We'll talk about an analogy to describe really what they are and put it into more context. Then we'll talk about the impact of credit scores and we'll talk about the main ingredients that go into credit scores. There's really 5 big factors and we'll talk about the percentage breakdown that each of them has on our scores. Then we'll go into the and such part of this presentation. It's the other stuff, the stuff that I just mentioned. Then we'll talk a little bit about debt payoff systems. I'll show you some examples as to how to go into paying off debt. And finally, I'll talk briefly about my recommended financial system and how this fits into the broader scheme of paying off debt if we have it. With that said, let's jump into the specifics. First of all, what is a credit score? Well, let's start here. People have heard of this idea of the FICO score. That stands for the Fair Isaac Corporation. So before we even had credit scores, if you think about it, things were really not fair. Like, how did people go about getting a loan or getting credit extended to them? Well, if we didn't have a basis through which we could quantify the likelihood that a borrower would repay a loan or a credit card within the next 24 months, well, then what did people go off of? They just went off of feel, right? Maybe Joe had some extra money that he wanted to be able to put to work. And he said, you know what? I'm going to loan it out to people and make an interest rate return on it so that my money grows over time. Well, how do I decide who's credible and I can loan it out to? Well, I'm going to loan it to Bob because I know him and I like him, but I'm not going to loan it to Jack because, I feel more suspicious about him, right? There was no basis for things. And so when we think about this idea of the Fair Isaac Corporation score, really the goal there was to be able to put numbers to the likelihood for a borrower to repay a loan or a credit card that they were utilizing, right? Now, with that said, is this score really fair at the end of the day? And here's where I want to bring in the analogy for you before we talk more specifically about things like the big 3 credit bureaus that you see listed on this screen. So here's the analogy that I want you to consider. When high school students are thinking about going to university or college, they at least used to be required to take this test, right? The test was called the SAT or the ACT. And ultimately, the goal of that test was to put one single score towards a student's capacities and abilities to succeed in college, right? Now, does that one single score at all capture the range of brilliance that we as human beings exhibit? Like, no way, right? Like, you sit down and you fill in the bubbles on a Scantron test. Like, no, brilliance expresses itself in many different forms, right? I've seen students who really struggled to sit down and take an exam, but who, when it came to building things with their hands, were just brilliant and had capacities far beyond what I myself can do. And I envy their abilities to do these types of things, right? But at the same time, why was this SAT or ACT, why was this test created? Well, because if you think about it, college admissions folks who are deciding who they want to come to their school and who they want to let in out of, many people who may want to go to that school, well, they had a really hard time figuring out how do you select among the many applicants, right? And so this was one of the ways in which they could try to capture the potential for a particular student to do well at that particular school without having to go through, the broad range of things that they could be assessing to try to make that prediction, right? So it standardized it in some way. And yet it still created a system that, it doesn't really truly capture the full range of brilliance that humans can exhibit, right? Well, I think that the FICO score is very similar in these regards, right? Like, we cannot capture a person's future potential to repay a loan all in one exact single score, and yet it does provide us with a way to be able to assess those types of things without, needing to figure out everything out there that's possible, including a person's, potential future when it comes to their finances, right? Somebody might have completely messed up in the past, but changed the way they manage their money, and they might be ready to take on more loans and use them responsibly now. But that's something that's really hard to capture because it's a future-based thing, right? And so what this FICO score does is it takes several different components. We'll talk about those exact ingredients in just a little bit, but it is meant to provide a standardized way to assess what's the likelihood that this borrower will repay a loan in the next 24 months, right? And so with that said, I want to jump into some of the things that you see listed on the screen here. There are these ideas of different types of credit scores available. FICO is the one that has been used for many years, but you can see the one listed next to it is called the Vantage score. That is a little bit of a newer type of calculation. It's meant to be a little bit more fair, let's call it, or at least include more information and more data. And yet we still see that one or the other may be used in different applications. We won't go into too much depth there, but just want you to know that there are a couple of different types of scores and the way that they calculate them out there. And actually, even within the FICO score, there are a number of different particular algorithms that are used to calculate that. The mortgage algorithm for a credit score is going to be different and a little bit more difficult than, for example, the algorithm that gets used when somebody applies for an auto loan. So good to just have that background knowledge. The other thing that I wanted to highlight is the fact that there are 3 different bureaus that collect information on our credit, and they are the 3 bureaus that provide these credit scores. Now, each of them measure credit scores slightly differently, right? In general, and we'll talk about this in just a second, but in general, credit scores go from around 300 to around 800 or 850, but each of the bureaus has a slightly different scale there, so that can get confusing. Just good to know about. The 3 bureaus are Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion. They also, as I mentioned previously, have different types of algorithms that can be used. So you can see up here listed the base algorithm, the base credit score. industry specific credit scores. So that might be something like a mortgage specific credit score. And there are even what's called proprietary credit risk scores. So each of those can be used at different times. The big thing that I want to highlight is down at the bottom of your screen here. It is annualcreditreport.com. That is the free government website that you can check on your credit report once a year. That is something that I highly encourage everybody to do. Now, it will not give you your credit score. This is a credit report. So it lists all of the things that go into that one credit score, but it's not actually showing you the score itself. What you would want to do with this is review everything that's listed on that credit report for accuracy. You want to make sure that there aren't accounts that you don't recognize that could be fraudulent. You want to make sure that everything in there lines up with what you're kind of expecting. And if something seems off, then you're going to want to dig into, hey, what is that? And sometimes a particular loan might have a different name listed on that credit report. So sometimes you'll see something that looks a little suspicious and you'll start to dig into it and you'll go, oh, hold on, actually that was, that this particular credit card or this auto loan. I just didn't recognize it at first, but it is good to just be monitoring that on a yearly basis. There's also a video that we did recently talking about credit freezes. So go check that one out. That is a great tool to be able to protect yourself. One of the tools to protect yourself during times that you're not necessarily going to be using credit or applying for a new line of credit. Okay. With that said, let's dive into some of the FICO basics. I've been mentioning this, but it's designed to predict the likelihood of delinquency for a particular borrower in the next 24 months. It's commonly used to set an interest rate on a loan, but it does not determine if the loan is approved or denied. And there are some other factors that can go into the interest rate that is set on any particular loan. One more thing that I'll mention about credit scores is sometimes people get obsessed with the credit score in particular. And I want to show you some of the general classifications needed here, because one of the things that comes up is above about a credit score of 740 or so, the advantage that you get from raising the credit score further starts to go down pretty significantly. And so credit score is not the only factor out there. I just want to keep harping on that idea. There are other factors, and we want to be thinking about this from a holistic perspective. Okay, I mentioned this, but credit scores typically range from around 300 to 850. Each of the bureaus categorizes them slightly differently. You can go into more specifics on what that means if you are curious, but a general classification is anywhere from 300 to 579 needs repair. If we're from 580 to 669, that's considered fair. You can also see 670 to 739 considered good, and above 740 is considered very good, and 800 and above is exceptional. So I see folks sometimes thinking about, my credit score is 760 or 780, and I really want to get it above 800. But in general, the impact there starts to go down quite a bit. And I would generally recommend that if people are in that above 740 range, I would want you to focus on other aspects of your money management and your financial life, because I think you'll get more bang for your buck if you're above that particular range. Let's talk about that just a little bit further, because this is an example that could show you theoretically some of the impact of a different credit score. Now, you'll see that there's a little arrow here that says, maybe, because this is just one example scenario that I don't think is relevant anymore in March of 2025 based on where interest rates are at. But theoretically, in an extreme scenario, this could be the difference between some of these particular credit scores. So let's look at this and see exactly what this means. What we see here is, by the way, notice that the top band here is from 720 to 850. Like I was saying, if you're kind of in the 740 and above range, your impact, it might be pretty minimal. But what we see here is that in this hypothetical scenario, somebody in that top band of credit, if they were offered a rate, an APR of 3.5%, then their monthly payment would be $543, and the total interest paid over this particular example loan, which is a 60-month auto loan of $30,000, it would end up being $2,604 paid over the entire term. Now, the reason that I say this, it has a big old asterisk next to it, is because this was based off of some interest rates that were offered during a time when interest rates were lower than they are now. We're not going to find anywhere that's giving necessarily a 3.5% auto loan in this particular time frame, right? So this is meant to show some of the more extreme versions of the possible impact here. Another thing that you'll find is mortgages are totally different than auto loans. The range of interest rates offered based off of credit score, I find to, in general, be a little tighter than what we find in the credit card world or in the auto loan world. And so this does not speak to every scenario out there by any means. And you really got to dig in and do this analysis for each particular loan that you may be taking out to determine what is the effect of your particular credit score and should you be trying to raise it over time. In general, though, if you're bringing your credit score up over time, it probably means that you're managing your money properly. So it's always beneficial to manage your money properly first and maybe not focus on the specific tips and tricks to bring your credit score up for one particular loan purchase. Okay, now I did want to just briefly go through the bottom band here. The difference in this hypothetical example scenario was a difference rate of 3.5 all the way up to 14.8, which seems crazy. Now, in that extreme scenario here, the difference in interest paid that you can see, the monthly payment would be $711 per month, and the total interest paid would be $12,666. So this is a big difference. Again, this is just meant to show you what the impact could theoretically be of bringing your credit score up. Credit does matter, so it's important to do it. Again, I think that if we have our money management systems tight all around, like we'll go into some examples of towards the end of this particular presentation, you'll see that overall our credit score is probably going to be pretty high to begin with. Okay, now let's talk about some of the ingredients that go into a credit score. In the FICO model, there are 5 big factors that go into credit score. You can see them listed here. It's payment history, capacity, that deals with the utilization ratio, its length of credit history, its mix of credit, and its new credit accumulation. You'll see some notes listed here, but on the right-hand side, what you'll see is a percentage. That percentage means the overall score is impacted by the percentage listed on the right for the particular impact that it has, right? So when we're calculating a FICO score, 35% of the total score is based off of the payment history. So more weight is placed on recent history, but if you're paying your credit card down every month on time, if you're paying your loans, your installment loans, your term loans, right, that have a monthly payment that's the same each time, if you're paying those on time, that contributes to 35% of your overall credit score. So this is the most important factor. But you'll notice that the next most important factor is at 30%. 30% of the credit score is based off of the capacity. I mentioned that deals with what we call the utilization ratio. Basically, it's the amount of available credit that you have on revolving credit lines, right? So things like credit cards where you can charge them up and then pay them off each month as you go, and paid balances on term loans as well. And so in this regard, capacity is king, right? I say that, but again, payment history is the most important. If you're paying off your loans every time, but having capacity means having a higher total available amount. And so the reason that we say that's king is because it can be important to have our total revolving limits go up over time, because it means that if we keep the utilization, meaning how much on average I'm charging on a card every single month, if we keep that lower, it tends to be better. Here's the example for you is if my capacity is $10,000, meaning I have one credit card and the total maximum amount I can spend on it per month is $10,000. Well, if I'm only using $1,000 per month on that particular credit card, then I'm only using 10% of the total capacity that I have. And that is a pretty darn good number. In general, it's good to keep your capacity or your utilization ratio below 20% of the total capacity that you have. Now, there's a little bit of a discrepancy here, right? We could say maybe 20 to 30%. You're still probably doing pretty well. But in general, the lower that your utilization ratio is, the better for your capacity specifically. Then we have length of credit history. That's the average amount of time between all of your credit lines that you've had them open. This can be important because sometimes people go to close a particular credit card, but when you close a credit card, it will bring your average length of credit history down. And so that can be an important factor to think about before you ever close a credit card is, hey, if that credit card does not have any sort of an annual fee associated with it, then you might want to leave it open and just not use that particular credit card. That does go into a little bit of money psychology, so take it as you will. We can talk more about that. As you know, you can book a meeting with me for free and we can go into some of these specifics because we do free financial coaching for our members here at On Top Credit Union. And I want to finish things off with the mix of credit makes up 10% of the credit score. So that's the variety in the types of loans that you have. Do you have a revolving line of credit, meaning a credit card or something like that you can charge up and then pay down on a monthly basis? Do you have a mortgage? Do you have an auto loan? Is your mix of credit varied? And then the new credit accumulation. So this looks at the number of new accounts opened in the last 12 to 18 months and the number of inquiries, meaning if I'm thinking about opening a new credit card or thinking about going and getting an auto loan, when I apply for that credit card or auto loan, that they're going to pull my credit. And that is a hard inquiry, meaning that they are checking up on what my credit is. That gets recorded because if people are just constantly thinking about opening a new credit card or a new, applying for a new auto loan, that does go into about 10% factor of what the credit score ends up being. Now, there is a shopping period on new inquiries because the credit bureaus recognize that, if I'm going and applying for an auto loan, I might be shopping rates. I might want to check with a couple of different dealers. And so in general, that shopping period, I like to say it's about 2 weeks. The reason I say that is because it does vary from credit bureau to credit bureau. Some of them have a longer shopping period window, up to 45 days. But if you keep all of your shopping done within 2 weeks, then you're not going to have to worry about, applying for 3 different or maybe even 4 different auto loan providers to be able to check and compare their rates. You're not going to keep getting dinged for that. One more thing to note on that front is that the ding in terms of credit score associated with that used to be much higher. It is now a much smaller penalty or ding to the credit score. We generally think of it as being somewhere around, a maximum of 5 points or so. Now that can depend on the exact scenario, so be careful with that. But in general, it tends to not be a massive hit to your credit score when you are applying for one particular new inquiry and you keep all of the other inquiries within that one shopping period. Okay, now let's go into some quick tips. When I do these presentations for a bigger audience, I'll also have you play a game, which is to discuss or think about which of the 5 credit factors applies most to each of these quick tips. So as I go through these, think about that and see if you can think which of the 5 factors, right? Payment history, capacity, length of credit history, mix of credit, or new credit accumulation. Which one of those applies most to each of these tips? The first tip is to strive to make payments on time. And I put in parentheses here, or in advance, because that's a special note. So which factor applies to that the most? Well, you might be thinking payment history, which is true. Absolutely. We want to be making those payments on time and showing through our history that we're consistently doing that. We're not late on our payments. But The special note here is that because of the way cash flow works, right? A credit card will have a statement that closes, let's say, at the end of the month. And so I'm charging that credit card throughout the month, but when that statement closes, I typically have about 20 to 25 days before the payment is actually due. And so that particular last statement may have closed, but I can actually extend it before I actually pay for that. The reason that I have a special note here is because as you're doing that, you're starting to charge up the next month's credit as well. And so that means that your utilization ratio will be continuing to climb until you make that payment. And so one trick here might be if I pay that particular credit card the day that the statement closes, then my utilization ratio will go back down, and that can bring my credit score a couple of points higher. So you could even argue that capacity is very important for that one as well. Okay, another tip is to keep revolving balances as low as possible in relation to your total limits, the utilization ratio. What do you think? If you said capacity, yes, that is exactly the big factor here. The next tip is don't necessarily close a revolving account, a credit card, after paid in full. So why might that be the case? And I know we talked about this a little bit, so hopefully you're thinking, hey, that's about the length of credit history. If I close that card, the length of credit history will go down. To open new accounts strategically, to think about type, credit limit, and average length of history. Well, hopefully you're thinking, hey, this is a mix of credit because am I using a bunch of different types? It's also a capacity deal because I want to think about what is my total capacity and how much do I use on a monthly basis. And of course, as it mentions right there, if I open a new card, then it will impact my average length of history because I have a brand new card right there. So I may even want to think about that strategically by going back to this list and seeing, hey, what percentage are each of these? Because it can give you an estimate of what the overall impact on your credit score might be. And of course, there's lots of different tools out there that can help us to do that, but it's definitely worth having these tips in the back of your mind. Okay, with that said, I want to talk about the other stuff that makes a big difference. Sometimes, like I mentioned, people focus so much on the credit score itself, but it turns out that when you go to get a new type of credit, a new line of credit or a new loan, then there's other factors that make a big difference. And so the ones I wanted to mention briefly are the debt to income ratio makes a big difference. That is, how much debt am I required to pay back on a monthly basis versus what is my total income? Well, if I'm required to pay back, let's say 20% debt obligations, 20% of my total income, then that's probably, depending on the types of debt that it is, that may be a pretty healthy number. Whereas if I'm required to pay back 50% or more, then that is something that would impact my ability to live my life, right? Because we have other obligations, we have living expenses and things like that. And so this debt to income ratio can make a big difference. And again, it depends on the type of loan that I'm applying for. A mortgage would be thinking about, it will have limits on the debt to income ratio, but a mortgage, it would seem more appropriate that that particular loan payment would be a higher percentage of my income than a credit card. The second factor that I wanted to briefly talk about is the loan to value. So that is, if I was to, let's say, take out a loan on a car or on a house, how much did I put down as a down payment on that loan? Because if I bought, let's say, the house, and use a really big number here just because it's an even number, let's say that a house costs $1 million, and I was to put down, the first 100,000 on that $1 million. Well, that would mean that the loan, because I already paid the first 100,000, the loan would only have to cover the next 900,000 to purchase the home. So the value of the home is 1 million, and I've already put down that 100,000. Well, there's 900,000 left, and that would mean that my loan is 90% of the value of the house. That matters when it comes to getting your next loan. That is a factor that plays into the approval. There are actually limits on what the loan to value can be depending on different things. Is it a home? Is it an auto loan? And that may even potentially play into the rate that is offered in some cases. Another factor that can be very important is reserves. Depending on the type of loan, I may have the lender be looking at how much do you have in reserves, in a savings account, in liquid money that could be used if something went wrong, right? If I go and I buy a home and my monthly mortgage payment is X, Y, or Z, well, what happens if my car was to break down and I needed a new car, and all of a sudden that is an extra payment going on, and so the lender would say, well, how much do you have in reserves? If you have $0 in savings, if something like that happened, then that could potentially be risky for that lender because you might stop paying on the home. Well, hopefully you wouldn't, but it could theoretically happen, right? And so that amount of reserves can be very important. In general, it's a great personal financial recommendation to have a long-term emergency reserve of somewhere between 3 to 6 months of your income. Meaning if something went wrong, you would be able to go for that many months before you ran out of money. Now, for somebody who's an entrepreneur, they might want to have more than that. They may want to have up to 12 months of emergency reserves. All depends on scenarios like that, but it is a factor that can go into a lender's willingness to extend credit to somebody. And finally, one other factor that can come into play is the use of cosigners. Now, that is a whole nother factor because a cosigner is then liable for the repayment of that loan also. But there are situations in which, let's say, a parent or family member is willing to be a cosigner on a loan that even if it's only going to the particular person, they'll cosign to help that person's ability to get the loan, oftentimes with the assumption that, hey, you're going to pay this off. You're going to, but it does put liability on them. So it is a very important conversation to be had before any of that happens. Okay, now I wanted to talk about this idea of debt payoff because too many people try to pay off too much debt at once. And the reason for that, I hinted at it previously, it's because of this idea of cash flow. So when we think about cash flow, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in the future, but when we think about cash flow, we talked about the fact that a credit card statement will close and then you have another, let's call it 22 days or so to pay off that particular statement, right? And so what happens with cash flow is, it's not all happening at once. There can be a difference in the timing of the cash flow. And so oftentimes when people are trying to pay off credit card debt, let's say, they really don't like that credit card debt, which is very reasonable. The interest rates charged on credit card debt are astounding. We're going to talk about those in just a little bit. But often what happens is they go, you know what? I have some extra savings over here. Let's say I have $1,000 of savings and the credit card debt is at $1,000. Well, this is a simplified scenario, but I'm like, you know what? I want to just get rid of this debt altogether. And so I'm going to take that $1,000 and just pay it off. Done. But then something happens a month later, or maybe it's 10 days later, whatever it is. We didn't, because cash flow is challenging to anticipate what's coming down the line. If we don't plan that properly and appropriately, then we can get into a situation where we either just have our normal monthly bills that cause us to not be able to pay it because we don't have that reserve $1,000 of savings anymore, and we go back into credit card debt. Or maybe my car breaks down or something like that, and I end up needing to go pay it off, and that causes me to need to go back into credit card debt or take out a high interest personal loan, whatever the case is, right? And so that is something that we see often. And the solution here, we're going to talk about it a little bit, but the solution is to use a cash flow plan, a cash flow spreadsheet or system that I'll show you some examples to decide on the exact monthly amount that you will be paying off, because you use a debt repayment calculator and you know the moment that that debt will be repaid and the exact amount of interest that will go towards it. So when you automate that monthly payment above the minimum repayment amount, if you're paying off credit card debt, for example, then you know exactly when it's going to be done for, but you're also able to keep a little bit more money in reserve savings for managing cash flow when things come up. Last thing that I'll say here is there's this idea of debt consolidation, right? Where you replace multiple debts with one lower interest loan. This is really important that you read the terms on the credit card introductory rates, because there are oftentimes these introductory rates where you will see a lower rate for a certain amount of months, let's say 12 months, 18 months, something like that. And the reason it's important is because oftentimes when you read the terms, if you do not pay all of that debt off by the end of the introductory rate, sometimes those terms will then back charge for the entire amount of time that they were at that introductory rate with the higher normal rate. So that's really important. As you can imagine, that would be a big impact for the amount of interest that somebody's going to pay. And finally, the last piece here is if you want a high credit score, remember that utilization ratio. So we will always want to be aware of where our utilization ratio is at, what's our total capacity, and how much are we using of that. Okay, let's get into how do we go about creating systems for our money management. Now, before we talk about it specifically, I always have to remind folks that the goal here is to begin to live by a vision of the future rather than a memory of the past. So many traditional budgets get us stuck in the past, right? We're thinking about, oh, we're getting to the end of the month and, what did I spend last month? And oh, shoot, I went over my budget again, right? We want to be projecting into the future and saying, what is it that I want to do with my money in order to live the life that I want to live, and to then begin to live by that type of a vision. So here's how we do that. We're going to start to talk about the numbers as we go through this. First of all, I mentioned this before, cash flow, right? It can be challenging to manage cash flow. And the point of all of this is to create systems that allow our money management to be simple, allow us to master the fundamentals, and then to begin to flow with our money. Okay, here is the main system that I recommend to be able to do that. It's the cash flow spreadsheet system. Now, what this is it's an iteration of the 50-30-20 principle, a very common rule out there in the financial education world. And this iteration says specifically that for our living expenses, we're going to set a goal of getting our living expenses to between 50 to 60% of our net income, our take-home pay. Then I'm going to set the goal of my savings being an automated monthly contribution to a savings account of between 5 to 10%. Those are for the short-term savings goals. Let's call it the next 5 to 10 years. Whereas my investments with a goal of 10% of my take-home pay, that's for the long term, right? That's for retirement. I'm not going to be touching those for a very long time. And finally, the last goal is to get my guilt-free spending number to between 20 to 35% of take-home pay. Now, all of these numbers can vary based on somebody's particular circumstances and situation. If I'm younger, then I can definitely expect my living expenses are probably going to be above that 60% range. And that is a goalpost for me to try to work towards over time. Because of that, when I'm younger, my guilt-free spending is probably not going to be at that 20% mark. And that's okay. One of the things to note about guilt-free spending is the point of it is if I know exactly how much guilt-free spending I have every single month, then I can separate that out and be able to not have to track it, but I can kind of keep an eye on it through the month and know where I'm at because I know exactly how much I have to spend every single month. And I've done some of the pre-planning for those big annual purchases. Like maybe I buy a ski pass every year. I love skiing, so I definitely do that. And I have to think about, the cost of the ski pass is X, Y, or Z. I need to take that and divide it by 12 months and create a savings goal for that big one-time purchase per year. And then the rest is what my guilt-free spending is on the monthly basis, right? But the thing about guilt-free spending is once we start to live by a higher standard of living, it's very hard for us to go back to a lower perceived standard of living. So I want to be very careful about upping my guilt-free spending over time. And in fact, if I'm young, I might be totally fine with my guilt-free spending being only at 5% or even less, because I'm trying to keep it there while I have things going to other parts of my life. And over time, I know that I'll get to be able to live more and more for the now as I've done more of that planning for the future. So worth considering. One thing I want to show you here is the fact that living expenses can be very challenging for people to figure out. For example, how much do I spend on a monthly basis on gas on average or on groceries? And in these regards, the OnTap app, which is now playing this video. Oops. I'm going to skip past the video. I want to invite you all to check it out. We have it on our YouTube channel. The thumbnail says, "Is this the best budgeting app?" It is fantastic. It is a really quick way to assess what are your living expenses. And then once you go into the cash flow spreadsheet, which you'll see an example of here, and we're going to dive into a little bit further, you'll be able to get those average numbers pretty easily, right? Because most people know, for example, up here we see rent or mortgage. Most people kind of know what that is on a monthly basis, right? It's the same every month. Utilities, same thing. But here, gas costs or groceries, that's the type of stuff that can be more challenging for us to really get a handle on. Now, let us escape this and go into an example scenario here. Okay, so here we have the example cash flow spreadsheet. Now, I want to show you this particular scenario. Total example here. This is a really person who's younger. So I've named him Anthony. I have a couple of different examples, A, B, C, and D, and I have their made up names be Anthony and Bethany and Kat and Devin, right? So this is Anthony's example spreadsheet. And what we see here is Anthony has recently completed training as an administrative assistant. He got a role as a customer service associate. He's making $50K a year. He's got a reasonable car, a used Honda Civic. Also has student loans. They're in deferment though for right now. So the total amount on those is $5,000, but he's not paying on them right now. Also has some credit card debt that has accrued during the time that those loans have been in deferment. So seems like Anthony might have been living a lifestyle that is perhaps above his means a little bit. That higher standard of living has meant that he's accrued some credit card debt and he wants to pay it off, and it's at 29% interest. He also wants to create a long-term emergency reserve savings of 3 months of living expenses. And so how are we going to get there over time? Because he also knows eventually he'll have to address those student loans. So let's dig into this particular scenario. Now, as you know, we see on the dashboard page of our cash flow spreadsheets, we get the overview. Now, remember, the living expense ratio, it's recommended to target between 50 to 60% of our take-home pay. Anthony's at 100%. Now, I will say one thing about this is this is a simplified scenario, right? What I do find often is, in this case, I did not, and you'll see this on the next page, I did not put in any bonuses that Anthony might get or any overtime that he might work. Oftentimes in the non-simplified scenarios, what happens for people is they might be spending more than they're making every single month, and that's being financed by credit card debt or some other type of debt, right? And oftentimes in these scenarios, what happens for people is they start to pay that off by working overtime like crazy or getting a bonus and putting it all towards paying that debt off. And this creates a little bit of a yo-yo scenario. Now, we can incorporate that. Again, feel free to book a session with me. We can talk specifically about how to deal with that. But working with these average numbers can be a really great way to go about this as well. So just keep in mind that it is a simplified scenario. We didn't include any bonuses or anything like that. Now, right off the bat on the dashboard page here, I can see that Anthony is living in a house that is pretty darn expensive. His housing expense ratio, which it's a common rule to target below 28% for your housing expense ratio, his is at 43.2%. So that's something he may want to consider downsizing or getting a roommate. That could lead to life-changing money management because it gives him an extra amount to be able to work with per month. Now, with that said, if he brings on a roommate, that's a whole job in itself, right? Like, you have to decide and get systems together with a roommate. Hey, I expect that dishes are never left in the sink. Here's how we're going to go about doing that. You may even want to have a process for screening who your potential roommate is going to be, right? So all of this stuff is really worth thinking about, but it is one option that could vastly change Anthony's cash flow here. Now notice that these two are blank, savings ratio and investments ratio. That's because Anthony is not contributing to savings or investments right now. And because he's spending everything on his living expenses, his guilt-free percentage is at 0%. Now, I suspect that he may be spending some guilt-free on things like going out to whatever, Chipotle or Chick-fil-A and getting meals that he's not making at home himself. You'll see that that's incorporated in the miscellaneous section of living expenses because there's stuff like that comes up. So we add an extra 15% onto our living expenses to incorporate all those things that we forgot about when we're putting that in play. Now, notice also that Anthony is, because he's not saving or investing, his savings rate is 0%, and we want to get that up to 20% or above, and his months of reserves are only at 0.3. Meaning he could go through 1/3 of a month before running out of money if something was to happen and he lost his job and didn't have an income. Okay, with that said, let's go into the cash flow section here. What we see for Anthony is he's making $50K a year. I've already done the calculations on what that translates to in terms of net. Here's his rent or mortgage, right? Quite high at $1,700 a month. At the same time, it is really hard to find places in Colorado that are reasonably expensive. Housing is the big rock in our financial jars, and it has gone wild. So just keep that in mind. But what we could do is, like I said, let's assume that Anthony wants to make big changes in his life and he goes and gets a roommate, right? And so, by the way, before I do anything here, I will just show you this also. His miscellaneous expenses, that 15% automatically added for things that you forgot, that's $435 a month. So let's say that Anthony gets really tight with his cash flow and he's like, no, I'm not missing anything. We're not adding that 15% on because I got it dialed in. Like, I need to be on top of my money and I'm not spending anything miscellaneous that I'm not calculating or thinking about, right? So I'm going to zero that out, the 435. Before I do that, I'll just show you not investing. So nothing here, not saving yet. And again, his guilt-free spending, he's at minus $1 per month. So theoretically, he's using $1 of credit card debt per month. So most is going to living expenses, right? Okay, so let's zero out that miscellaneous expense because Anthony is on top of things right now. Well, that's going to give him $434 a month in his guilt-free spending. Now, should he go and spend that on whatever he wants? No, he's getting tight, right? So we're going to redistribute that to some savings and to some debt repayment because remember, Anthony still has this $10,000 of credit card debt that's being charged 29% interest. We're going to talk about what that looks like. So I got back $434 right there. So let's say that even without going and changing his housing expense or getting a roommate, let's say that just with that $434 a month, Anthony starts to put some of it towards a long-term emergency reserve. Let's say that he puts $100. Actually, let's make it $134 a month towards his savings. Check that out. His savings are already at 4%. That's pretty darn good. And he's saving $134 a month for when something happens. Maybe the car breaks down or whatever the case is, right? So this is creating a bit of a buffer, a reserve that he can draw from if something goes wrong. Okay, because that's $134 a month, we have $300 a month left over that if Anthony keeps things tight and is not using any money on guilt-free spending, what's it going to do to his debt payments, his credit card repayments? Well, let's go in and say that we have $10,000 owed. This is 29% interest. And let's say that Anthony's paying the minimum. Okay, so he's paying $250 a month towards the credit card here. In general, your minimum payment towards a credit card, probably somewhere around 2.5% of the total balance. In this case, got $10,000, $250 a month, that lines up. Okay, so what we see here is I'm paying $250 a month towards that credit card. It's gonna take me 143 months to pay that thing off. That's a long time. And check this out, the total balance is only $10,000 and I'm gonna pay $25,000 of interest? Are you kidding me? My goodness. Okay, so what would happen if Anthony increases the above the minimum payment just a little bit? Remember, I got $300 a month to work with right now. Let's say that I increase it only by $100 a month, right? And he kept some in his guilt-free spending. So I suggest he keeps that tight and uses the whole 300. But let's say that we increase it by just $100 a month. I'm about to hit enter and watch what happens to these numbers right here. 143 months and the total interest paid of $25,000. Calculate. Wow. 50 months. And only paying $7,000-ish of interest. This makes a big difference. And that was only $100 a month. Let's increase it up to $200 a month. So now I'm gonna pay $450 and watch what happens to these numbers. 50 months, $7,000 of interest. Now I'm down to 33 months and only $4,600 of interest paid. Okay, let's bring that up to the total amount of $550 a month. Calculate, watch the 33 months and the $4,600. Calculate 25 months and $3,400 of interest. Okay, so notice that as you increase your payment above the minimum payment, you make a big difference in what's going on. But also notice that as you continue to increase that minimum payment by another $100 a month, the impact of it starts to go down a little bit, right? It's not as big of a difference as that first one for going from $25,000 of interest paid to only $7,000. That was a massive difference, but it is still making a big difference in how we're able to pay this off more quickly and pay less interest on it. And once we pay this off more quickly, that means that we will have that entire chunk that we're paying, the $550 a month, we will get all of that back into our monthly cash flow once we pay this thing off completely. So how do you think that would affect Anthony's finances to have, to have 550 back? And by the way, I'm gonna go ahead and change this to our amount now that we're paying towards the debt repayment. Notice that guilt-free spending is back to zero, but I'm still putting $134 a month towards my savings. So Anthony could, if he wanted to, actually do $234 and only pay $450. That's for him to figure out, for you all to figure out what you want to make that monthly amount. Or maybe you put some towards guilt-free spending. But do you see how this opens up options for you? And you can pay back this amount over time, right? So that's all that I'm gonna say. We didn't even go into what if Anthony got a roommate, right? What if he was only paying $1,000 a month and had $700 extra coming back to him? Or maybe he's charging his roommate more than that. Who knows? This opens up options for people like Anthony to be able to take control of that debt. Okay, the last things that I'll say here are you can see my recommended system here for account setups. The reason that this can be so valuable is because what's happening is your paycheck gets direct deposited into your checking account, right? I like to call that a cash flow account. You have a little bit coming off if you have access to a 401k to go towards that 401k, right? If you have a match on a 401k, that's free money right there. So I definitely want to be contributing to that. So then within this cash flow account, I can then separate things out. My living expenses, I want to mostly automate, right? I want to automate my rent payments. I want to automate some of the things that I can so that I'm not thinking about that every month and having to go pay it off. My life will get busy and I'll miss one of those payments at some point, right? So this keeps things simple for us, but there are things like credit cards where we can still automate the payment every month, but we gotta be keeping track of what's going on in that regard. For some people, they may want to only use debit cards. Book a session with me, we can talk through that type of strategy. Now, again, I want to be automating my savings and investments, but here's the big part that I wanted to talk about here is what if I automate my guilt-free number? So let's say that I decide that in Anthony's case, let's say he decided that he wanted to have $100 a month going towards guilt-free spending. Well, great. What you want to do is create a second guilt-free checking account, a cash guilt-free account in general. And if I automate that $100 a month going into that guilt-free account, then I don't have to be tracking every receipt and trying to separate out what's my fun money versus what's my gas money and things like that. I can keep it all in that one account and just kind of watch it through the month and keep track of it using the OnTap mobile app. And that way I'm able to find flow with my finances and spend the money that I have on guilt-free for this month while also knowing that I'm covering things for the future. So hopefully you can see how this can really help you to figure out your money management system. I also have noted over here, there's a free planning tool. This one in particular comes from the CFPB. Great financial resource out there that hopefully will continue on in the future, but it is a planning tool where we can start to see our cash flow. I don't even use a tool like that anymore. I program it into my calendar because I live and die by my calendar. And so then I can see things and plan as I'm doing my calendar work just on my computer or on my mobile phone. And that's what allows me to do my planning. So again, we can talk about systems that might work for you in that regard. I also want to highlight the fact that getting started is more important than becoming an expert. So dive in, grab yourself a free copy of the Cash Flow System spreadsheet, book a free coaching session with me. We can continue this process and continue developing what you want to be your own personal system for money management. Last thing I'll say here before I provide a few resources for you is, I love this quote from Joe Hudson. He says, "Joy is the matriarch of the family of emotions, and she will not come into a house where her children are not welcomed." So when we're talking about making our money more joyful, I do want to highlight that it's not always going to be fluffy roses and happy feelings, right? A joyful life in general is not one in which we reject the other emotions or even just simply tolerate the other emotions that come along with it. We have to recognize that we have to welcome them in. And that will be the case in our money management, where there will be times where it's not perfect and that it feels stressful. But the more that we can practice this right here, the more we will make our broader money management systems joyful for ourselves. Over at OnTap Credit Union, many of you already know, but we are a not-for-profit community chartered credit union. Notice how I didn't talk about any of the great, fantastic products and services that we have available, whether they be deposit accounts that have high yields or whether it be loans that have lower rates, things like that. The point is that as a not-for-profit, we serve our community in these regards and we have those great products. So if you are not already a member of OnTap Credit Union and you don't love where you're banking currently, come open a free account with us. I think you will greatly enjoy what we have going on and the level of service and help that we're able to provide. With that said, I will close out just saying we have a 6-week education coaching program showing some of the details right here. And reach out to me, Mmoore, MMOORE at ontapcu.org. Shoot me an email. We can tell you more information about this or get it scheduled and get rolling on this coaching program with you. The last piece that I will share is we have a free PDF guide available. You can scan the QR code right here to get access to that. We call it Money Hacks. It's the quick start path to developing a stronger relationship with your money. You can also book an appointment with me using this QR code on the bottom left. And finally, this is a survey that if you enjoyed or you have feedback for this particular presentation on Credit 101, scan that, give us some feedback, let us know what you think. Other than that, connect with us on LinkedIn. This is my personal LinkedIn, and we are excited to be able to continue to serve you further. Have a great day, you all.